The Cold War, a crucial period in human history, a period that affected the entire world and was on the verge of becoming the last period humanity would ever see. So what happened there? Let's start with the general. The Cold War was a tense political and military confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union after World War II. These superpowers did not engage in direct military conflict. Instead, they chose to develop influence among other states and support armed conflicts on the side of their allies. But this did not prevent the world from being on the brink of nuclear war until 1991. The Cold War led to a number of technological discoveries, not only in military affairs, but also showed humanity very well what propaganda and information warfare are. Thus, unfinished communism and capitalism enter the battle. The starting point can be considered Harry Truman, who in 1947 announced a policy of containing communism and supporting countries that were threatened by its spread. After the Second World War, Germany was divided into zones of influence between the Allies, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, and this was the beginning of one of the key events, the blockade of Berlin. Berlin, as the capital of Germany, was also divided into 4 sectors. In 1948, the United States, Great Britain, and France decided to unite their sectors and introduce a new currency, the West German mark. The Soviet Union responded by imposing a blockade, cutting off all roads, railways, and river routes that connected West Berlin to the western zones. This led to a decline, but in response to the blockade, the Allied forces organized the Air Bridge, a massive humanitarian aid operation to provide the population of West Berlin with food, fuel, and other essential resources. This operation lasted about 11 months and proved to be successful. It ended with the lifting of the blockade after the Soviet Union recognized that the blockade had not achieved its goal. On June 25, 1950, Communist North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, attacked anti-Western South Korea. Initially, North Korea was successful and almost completely conquered South Korea. However, the involvement of international forces led by the United States changed the course of the war. South Korean and Allied forces counterattacked and regained control of many territories. The Korean War left behind anxiety and divisions. The country remained divided into North and South Korea, with the demarcation line becoming one of the most enduring examples of the world's division into East and West. The war also required a great human tragedy with a large number of deaths and destruction of infrastructure, another example of how the battle of imposed ideologies brings only poverty, suffering and grief to the people. And now we come to the most tense event of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, the USSR placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, which was in the indirect influence area of the United States. The United States considered this a direct threat to its national security, and President John F. Kennedy declared a blockade of Cuba. He stated that any missile launch from Cuba would be considered an act of aggression that could lead to war. As a result, the world was on the brink of nuclear war, and the greatest nuclear threat in human history was close to being realized. For several tense days, diplomatic negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union continued, and the world waited to see what steps both sides would take. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point in the Cold War, as it showed the dangers of nuclear weapons and the high risk of nuclear conflict between the rivals. After the crisis, both sides began to realize the need to control and limit nuclear arsenals, and this contributed to the subsequent negotiations on nuclear disarmament. However, another incident occurred on September 26, 1983. A Soviet military computer mistakenly perceived a missile launch from the West and issued a warning of a nuclear attack. But Senior Lieutenant Stanislav Petrov, who was responsible for testing the system, did not consider it credible enough and refused to signal a response. It turned out to be a system error, and the danger of nuclear war was averted. Next, Vietnam, since 1955. A communist regime in the north and an anti-communist coalition in the south. The Vietnam War caused great human suffering and material damage. Bombings, violence, and massacres, particularly during the My Lai massacre, were the subject of sharp criticism and outrage around the world. Protest movements against the war in the United States and elsewhere intensified, and it was one of the first wars to be broadcast live on television, which led to growing public outrage. In 1973, the United States withdrew its troops from Vietnam, but the war continued between North and South Vietnam. In 1975, the North Vietnamese army emerged victorious and Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, was captured. This led to the unification of Vietnam under communist rule. The conflict between the United States and the Soviets developed not only on the basis of geopolitics, but also the space race. It began with the launch of the first Earth satellite, the Soviet Sputnik 1, in 1957. This Soviet success caused shock and indignation in the United States, which responded by launching its first satellite, Explorer 1, in 1958. And so it went on, with both sides making great efforts to obtain firsts and discoveries in space, such as the first orbital flight of Yuri Gagarin on April 12, 1961, and the landing of American astronaut Neil Armstrong on the Moon during the Apollo 11 mission in 1969. The space race had a great impact on technological development and scientific research. As a result of this competition, new technologies have been developed that have found application in various fields, such as telecommunications, medicine, computer technology, etc. I decided not to cover the topic of Afghanistan in this video, so let's move on to the final stages. The fall of the Berlin Wall. The events that led to this long-awaited date can be traced back to the summer of 1989, when a large wave of mass protests began in East Germany. The protests were directed against the authoritarian communist regime and economic problems. As a result of these protests, people began to cross the borders between East and West Berlin en masse. November 9, 1989 was a decisive day. At a press conference, a representative of East Germany mistakenly announced that he was allowing unrestricted crossing between the Berlin sectors. This statement caused a large wave of people to gather near the walls. The crowds and the shelter provided by the West Germans forced the East German border guards to open checkpoints. Thousands of people traveled to the border and began crossing the Berlin Wall. This event sparked joy, emotion, and unity among Germans and people around the world. It also marked the beginning of the process of German reunification, which officially took place on October 3, 1990. In 1991, under the influence of a number of events, including political instability in the country, economic decline, and pressure for self-determination of national republics, the USSR collapsed. On December 25, 1991, Russian President Boris Yeltsin announced the end of the USSR and the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, which united many former Soviet republics. The collapse of the USSR in the projection of the Cold War had a significant impact on world politics and the geopolitical landscape. It ended the era of a bipolar world in which the United States and the USSR were the main rivals. The collapse of the USSR also caused changes in the internal political system of many countries, the expansion of NATO, and a shift in the geography of world power. Thank you for watching. Express your opinion in the comments and rate the video.